Far across the sea, a man named Jonah tried to run from the voice of God.
But no ship, no storm, and no ocean depth could hide him from the Lord's plan. This is the story of fear, mercy, and the great fish that changed Jonah
The sun
forever.
hung heavy over the village, turning the dust into a fine, golden haze that clung to the stone walls. Jonah walked the main thoroughfare, his boots striking the packed earth with a steady, rhythmic thud. Around him, the market was waking. Merchants shifted heavy clay jars, the sound of pottery scraping against stone ringing out in the morning air. Scents of dry earth, baked bread, and roasting spices drifted between the stalls. Thick and warm, he moved with a deliberate gait, his focus fixed on the path ahead. He checked the seal on a water-kin, adjusted his position, and continued past the stalls where vendors bartered for grain. Every movement was practiced, predictable, and calm. The village was a place of known patterns, where the passage of time was marked only by the shifting shadows of the eaves. Jonah turned a corner, his face catching the direct glare of the rising sun. He paused for a moment to watch a group of children chasing a stray dog near the town well. The village was alive with the mundane business of living. There was no hint of the storm that would soon pull him from this soil, no warning in the quiet wind that blew across the valley. He simply took another step, steady and unbothered, unaware that the horizon was about to shift. The birds went silent. Not a gradual fading, but a total, abrupt cessation of sound. The wind, which had been stirring the dust moments before, locked into stillness. Jonah stopped mid-stride. He felt the hair on his arms rise as the air pressure dropped, thickening like water. Then, the light arrived. It was not a flash, but a slow, steady descent of brilliance that bypassed his eyes and seemed to settle directly into his marrow. The marketplace vanished behind the glow. The clay jars and the stone paths lost their color. Radiance washed him. Then a voice resonated within, deep and rhythmic, like the movement of a vast, churning sea. Jonah, son of Amittai. The presence echoed, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. Arise, go to the great city of Nineveh. Speak against it, for its wickedness has reached me. The command hung in the air, weighted with an authority that left no room for hesitation. Jonah remained rooted to the spot. His breath hitched, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged bursts. The reality of the destination, the city of his enemies, pressed down upon him. He stood trembling, the golden morning replaced by the crushing weight of a divine expectation he could not fathom. The command echoed, but it did not settle. It burned. Jonah felt the heat of the light fade, replaced by a cold, hard knot of resistance forming in his stomach. He pictured the walls of Nineveh. He saw the smoke rising from their cruel fires and heard the echoes of their malice against his people. The memory of their violence was a physical weight, sharper than any blade. His hands, which had been hanging limp, began to tremble not with fear, but with a rising, bitter heat. He tightened his grip. His knuckles turned white, his fingers digging into his palms until the skin stung. A sharp, jagged breath escaped his lips. He refused. The thought solidified like stone. He set his jaw, grinding his teeth until his head throbbed. Every instinct screamed against the path he had been given. He looked at the sky, not in prayer, but in challenge. His eyes narrowed, focusing on a point far beyond the village, far beyond the reach of the light. He would not be the vessel for their mercy. He would not offer them a chance to turn. With a sudden, forceful exhale, he pulled his hands away from his sides and braced himself against the earth. The decision was made. The rebellion was absolute. Jonah lunged forward, his feet striking the hard-packed earth with a frantic, uneven rhythm. He did not look back at the village. The memory of the command still pulsed in his mind, a persistent rhythm that drove him faster. He pushed his body, ignoring the ache in his calves and the dust coating his throat. Every step was a strike against the silence that had followed the voice. He navigated the rocky inclines, his hands brushing against jagged stones as he scrambled over ridges. His lungs burned, pulling in the dry, heated air of the desert path. He felt as though the very horizon was receding, pulling the destination further away the harder he pushed. He kept his head low, eyes locked onto the path ahead, watching the way the dust kicked up in swirling clouds behind his heels. He accelerated, his muscles straining, his movements becoming more erratic as panic began to override his resolve. He felt the weight of the command behind him like a physical pressure, a presence that seemed to track his every movement. He sprinted through a narrow pass, his breathing ragged, his focus narrowed down to the single goal of reaching the coast. He would put the entire breadth of the land between himself and the source of that voice. He pushed harder, desperate to outrun the impossible, his stride lengthening as the path began to slope downward toward the sea. The air changed. The dry, dusty heat of the trail vanished, replaced by the heavy, thick scent of brine and boiling tar. Jonah stumbled into the Joppa harbor, his lungs seizing at the sudden shift in atmosphere. The noise hit him like a physical blow, the rhythmic thud of crates hitting wooden planks, the shouts of merchants, the screech of gulls diving for scraps. He pushed through the press of bodies, his shoulders knocking against rough-hewn timber and damp nets. Every face he passed blurred into a mask of indifference. He ignored the calls of traders, his eyes darting across the shoreline, scanning the waterline. He needed a way out. A vessel. Anything that pointed away from the land. He tripped over a discarded mooring line, caught his balance, and shoved a man aside to reach the edge of the quay. The harbor was a maze of masts and tangled rigging. The smell of rot and salt clung to his skin, stinging his senses. He scanned the rows of hulls, his heart hammering against his ribs. There, at the furthest pier, a ship sat low in the water, its crew scrambling to untie the lines. He lunged toward the slipway, his boots skidding on the slime-slicked wood, desperate to catch the captain before the gangplank lifted. Jonah reached the edge of the pier just as the final mooring rope began to slacken. He waved his arms, catching the attention of the man standing near the helm. The captain watched him approach, his gaze lingering on the dust and salt caked into Jonah's skin. Jonah did not wait for an invitation. He pulled a heavy leather pouch from his side and tossed it across the gap. The coins clinked against the wooden deck with a sharp, metallic ring. The captain caught the pouch, weighed it in his palm, and nodded once toward the gangplank. Jonah scrambled up the narrow, swaying timber, his boots hammered against the wood, the vibration traveling up through his legs as the hull groaned under the shifting tide. He stepped onto the deck, the wood slick with moisture. Behind him, the gap between the ship and the dock widened into a dark sliver of churning water. He gripped the rough railing, watching the harbor retreat into a blurred smear of gray and brown. The ship tilted, caught by a sudden swell, and settled into a steady, rhythmic rocking. He let out a long, ragged breath, his shoulders dropping. The distance between him and the shore felt like a wall of safety. He watched the land shrink, convinced he had finally outrun the reach of the voice. The sunlight on the deck felt suddenly dangerous, too bright and too exposing. Jonah turned away from the railing, his boots making no sound on the damp, splintered wood as he moved toward the hatch. He descended the ladder, each step taking him further from the world he knew and deeper into the belly of the vessel. The air here was stagnant, thick with the smell of wet timber, bilge water, and rotting rope. He crawled past stacks of cargo, the space narrowing until he was forced to hunch his shoulders against the low, curved beams of the hull. He found a recess behind a pile of heavy, salt-crusted crates. It was a pocket of absolute shadow. He tucked his knees against his chest and pulled his frame tight, pressing his back into the rough wall of the ship. The wood groaned under the pressure of the swells, a low, rhythmic creak that reverberated through the floorboards. Outside, the world was moving, but here, he sought to be invisible. He closed his eyes, listening to the water slap against the hull, hoping the darkness would anchor him to this newfound anonymity. He remained motionless, a single point of stillness in the shifting, swaying hold, waiting for the land to disappear completely. The ship caught the deep water current, its pace quickening as the familiar coastline dissolved into a thin, jagged line on the horizon. Above, the crew moved with practiced efficiency, hoisting canvas and securing lines, their voices drifting down through the floorboards as muffled, rhythmic shouts. Jonah remained pressed against the hull, counting the pulse of the waves against the timber. Each heave of the ship carried him further from the life he had abandoned. Then, the rhythmic creaking of the ship changed. The constant, predictable slap of water against the side faltered. A sudden, heavy stillness descended upon the deck, silencing the sailors mid-task. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jonah shifted his weight, the cold sweat on his palms slick against the wood. He could feel the vessel drifting into the vast, indifferent center of the sea, where no land remained to mark his path. An unbidden, cold sensation crawled up his spine, a visceral reaction to the sheer emptiness surrounding the ship. He pulled his knees tighter, his knuckles white, waiting for the silence to break. He knew, with a certainty that defied reason, that he was moving toward something he could not outrun. The stillness did not last. It snapped like a dry branch. The air pressure plummeted so sharply that Jonah felt the change in his own ears. A sudden, ringing vacuum. Above the hold, the sky transformed. The bright daylight was strangled by a wall of ink-black clouds that raced across the horizon, consuming the sun in seconds. The transition was absolute. Darkness bled into every corner of the ship. Then came the first sound, a low, guttural moan that rose from the horizon, vibrating through the very keel of the vessel. It was the wind, awakening with a violent, hungry intensity. The ship lurched, catching the first of the gale-force gusts. High above, the masts groaned under the sudden strain as the sails whipped and snapped like thunderclaps. The wood of the hull screamed as it was hammered by the rising sea. Jonah felt the deck tilt beneath him, sliding him across the floorboards as the vessel lost its steady footing. The escape was over. The atmosphere in the hold turned frantic. The ship was no longer sailing. It was being hunted. The wind shrieked through the rigging, a relentless, deafening roar that drowned out all other sound. The storm had arrived, and there was nowhere left to hide. The ocean rose up like a solid wall, dwarfing the mast. The ship crested the peak, hung for a heartbeat in the freezing air, and then slammed down into the trough with a bone-jarring impact. Water surged across the deck, knee-deep and heavy, sweeping away ropes and loose timber. The vessel tilted at a precarious angle, sending the crew sliding toward the leeward rail. They fought for purchase, fingers clawing at the slick, wet wood. The captain screamed orders that vanished into the roar of the gale. Panic took hold, sharp and immediate. Sailors rushed to the crates, lashed to the center of the deck, their movements erratic and desperate. They pried the bindings loose with iron bars, heaving heavy barrels over the side to lighten the load. Each crate hit the water and vanished instantly. The ship groaned, a sound of splintering wood echoing from deep within the hull, as another wave struck, broader and taller than the last. The deck pitched again, throwing men into the churning foam. They scrambled back to their feet, eyes wide and fixed on the horizon, fighting the gravity of the sinking vessel with every ounce of remaining strength. Below the waterline, the world was a rhythmic, violent shudder. The hull groaned, metal and wood shrieking as the ship twisted against the onslaught of the sea. Inside the cramped storage hold, the air was thick with the smell of wet timber and brine. Jonah sat in the corner, his back pressed against the vibrating wall, his eyes shut tight, ignoring the cacophony of the storm. The hatch above flew open, spilling a torrent of seawater onto the floorboards. The captain dropped down, his movements jerky and unbalanced. He landed hard, his hands finding purchase on the support beams as the ship tilted sharply to the port side. He moved through the darkness, stumbling over displaced crates, until he spotted the figure huddled in the shadows. The captain reached out, his grip iron-hard, and hauled Jonah toward the ladder. He did not speak, he simply shoved, his face set in a mask of grim, desperate urgency. Jonah stumbled, hit the ladder, and began to climb. The roar of the thunder grew louder with every step toward the deck. They emerged into the driving spray, the vessel pitching wildly as the wind tore at the masts. The captain did not let go, pushing Jonah forward until he stood exposed to the full, terrifying fury of the sea. The deck was a slick, unstable surface of spray and salt. Jonah stood frozen as the ship lurched, his feet barely holding their position against the incline. Around him, the crew stopped their frantic bailing. They watched the horizon, then turned their gaze toward the center of the deck, where the wind seemed to spiral with a deliberate, unnatural focus. The captain wiped water from his eyes, his breathing ragged. He signaled to the men, and they crowded together, their faces hard and searching. Someone produced a handful of marked stones. They moved with a grim, rhythmic precision, casting the lots onto the wet timber. The stones skittered, clattering against the grain of the wood, coming to rest in a pattern that left no room for doubt. Every man stepped back, clearing a circle around the spot where Jonah stood. The silence from the crew was heavier than the roar of the gale. They looked at the stones, then looked at him. The realization hit the deck like a physical blow. The storm was not a random act of nature, but a pursuit. Jonah felt the weight of their collective stare, the air between them thick with sudden, sharp accusation. Jonah stood amidst the spray, the wind whipping his hair across his eyes. He looked at the sailors. Seeing the reflection of his own fear in their grim expressions, he took a breath, the salt air burning his throat. "It is because of me," he said. His voice was thin against the thunder, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. He gestured toward the horizon, where the waves rose like black walls. "I have fled from the presence of the one who commands the sea and the dry land. This tempest follows me." The crew stared, their hands slackening on the ropes. Jonah stepped toward the railing, his movements deliberate. "Pick me up and throw me into the deep. Only then will the water become calm for you." He did not look back. He leaned over the edge, feeling the spray lash against his face. The sailors hesitated, their eyes darting between the raging swells and the man who stood ready to pay the price. They gripped their oars with white-knuckled intensity, attempting one last, futile push against the current, but the ship groaned and pivoted, trapped in the eye of the gale. Jonah turned back to them, his posture rigid, waiting for the only resolution left to them. The sailors moved as if under a heavy burden. They surrounded Jonah, their faces hardened by the spray and the impossible choice forced upon them. One reached out, grabbing his arm, another took his legs. There was no gentleness in the motion. They heaved together, straining against the violent pitch of the deck as the ship groaned under the weight of a massive, cresting wave. Jonah felt the air leave his lungs as he was lifted off the wet timber. For a heartbeat, he was suspended above the churning chaos of the sea. He saw the dark, swirling depths rising to meet him, a vortex of foam and black water. Then gravity reclaimed him. He fell, a stone tossed into an abyss. The impact was an immediate, blinding shock of cold. It struck his chest with the force of a falling wall, driving the air from his body in a frantic, bubbling gasp. He tumbled through the froth, pulled down by the relentless weight of the ocean, spinning in a world of muted sound and stinging. Salt-choked water. He reached out into the dark, his fingers clawing at the emptiness as the surface vanished above him, leaving only the crushing, silent pressure of the deep. The moment his body broke the surface, the violence of the storm simply ceased. It did not fade, it vanished. The howling wind that had threatened to tear the ship apart hit a wall of absolute silence. The mountainous waves, which seconds ago had reached for the clouds, lost their momentum and smoothed into a vast, obsidian mirror. On the deck, the sailors staggered as the ship stopped its frantic pitching. They stood paralyzed, their hands still gripping ropes and broken rigging. The rain stopped mid-air, leaving the air heavy and still. One sailor walked to the side, peering over the rail. He saw nothing but his own reflection staring back from the glassy, undisturbed black expanse. No ripple disturbed the water where Jonah had vanished. The captain lowered his head, his chest heaving with ragged breaths as he looked from the empty sea to the cloud-cleared sky. The terror of the storm was replaced by a deeper, colder dread. They stood in the center of a void, the ship motionless, held in the grip of a power that had turned the fury of the ocean into a tomb. No one spoke, no one moved. The sea had claimed its price, and in the resulting stillness, the weight of what they had witnessed settled over them like a shroud. Below the surface, the darkness was absolute. Jonah descended, his limbs heavy and unresponsive in the freezing brine. He tried to kick, but the water held him like a vice. His lungs burned, a sharp, rhythmic agony pulsing behind his ribs. He watched the faint glimmer of the surface shrink to a pinprick, then vanish entirely. He was alone in the deep, sinking toward an unseen floor. Then, the water shifted. A pressure wave, distinct from the currents, pushed against his back. The temperature dropped further, a sudden, unnatural chill. He turned, straining his eyes against the murk. A shadow, vast and impossible, blocked the weak light from above. It was not a rock. It possessed a deliberate, predatory momentum. Before he could draw another breath, a colossal wall of slick, shifting matter surged forward. The space around him folded. He was caught in a powerful, rushing torrent of water that spun him violently. Stripping the strength from his limbs, he hit a soft, yielding surface that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic force. The light was gone. The water receded, replaced by a thick, oppressive air. He lay still, trapped in a cavernous, living void, as the entrance behind him sealed shut with a final, wet thud. The air was thick, tasting of brine and ancient, stagnant depths. Jonah pushed himself up, his palms sliding against a slick, uneven surface that felt like wet, living cartilage. There was no light, yet the space held a faint, sickly blue-green luminescence that seemed to bleed from the walls themselves. It was a suffocating, dim glow that revealed nothing but the curvature of his prison. He tried to stand, but the ceiling was too low, forcing him to remain hunched. Every few seconds, the ground beneath him shifted with a slow, powerful heave. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse, a colossal heartbeat that vibrated through his bones, reminding him that he was not in a cave, but inside a living entity. He touched the wall. It was warm, yielding, and covered in a thin, viscous film. He pulled his hand back, wiping it against the floor, but the moisture remained. The silence here was heavy, pressing against his eardrums with the weight of the entire ocean above. He sat back on his heels, his breath hitching in the damp air. There was no escape, no horizon, and no wind. Only the slow, relentless thud of the giant creature moving through the dark, and the crushing realization that he was entirely at the mercy of the void. The heartbeat of the creature remained the only clock in the dark. Jonah watched his own hands, visible only as pale shapes in the dim, bioluminescent gloom. He stopped pacing. The frantic need to find a way out, to claw at the walls or shout into the abyss, drained away. The walls of his prison did not change, but the air inside no longer felt like a grave. He drew a long, ragged breath, feeling the oxygen cycle through the cavernous space. He sank to his knees. The surface beneath him was soft, yielding to his weight. He pressed his palms together, the skin cold and slick, and tilted his head back against the curved, pulsing wall. He did not ask for the sea to open or the creature to release him. He spoke into the damp, heavy silence, his voice cracking at first, then gaining strength. "Lord, I cried from the depths, and you heard me." The words hung in the air, stripped of his former pride. Each syllable was a surrender, an admission that the path he had chosen led only to this place of total isolation. He bowed his head, closing his eyes, and let the hollow ache of his own rebellion dissolve into the quiet, waiting for a response that he knew would come. The prayer ended, but the silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of a man hiding. It was the silence of a man found. Jonah remained on his knees, his forehead resting against the warm, pulsating membrane of the creature. He felt the vast, cold pressure of the ocean currents pressing against the exterior of his prison. It was a weight he could never outrun, a depth he could never fathom. His hands, once clenched in defiance, now lay open and still. The memory of the market in his village, the dust of the road to Joppa, and the terror of the storm all collided in his mind. He saw the path he had taken not as a journey of escape, but as a long, winding circle that had inevitably led him back to the presence he tried to flee. The hollow ache in his chest was not pain, but the final collapse of his pride. He realized then that the walls enclosing him were not merely the boundaries of a creature, but the boundaries of his own stubborn will. He exhaled, his shoulders dropping, and he let go of the last remnants of his struggle. He was not a passenger in a beast, but a man held in the palm of a purpose he could no longer deny. He waited, his heart finally matching the slow, steady rhythm of the sea. The steady rhythm of the deep changed. The creature surged upward, the motion violent and disorienting. Pressure built against Jonah's ears, then vanished as the beast broke the surface. Light flooded the dark chamber, blinding and sharp, piercing through the gaps as the massive jaws wrenched open. Jonah was pushed forward by a rush of water, sliding along the slick,
internal surface before he was ejected into the open air. He hit the ground hard. His body skidded across the course,
sun-baked sand, his limbs tangling in the rough grit. He rolled, coughing,
his lungs seizing as they struggled to process the dry, hot air after days of suffocating moisture. He pressed his palms into the earth,
feeling the intense heat radiating from the ground. He was caked in salt, his skin tight and itching, coated in fragments of seaweed and debris. He pushed himself to his hands and knees, his head hanging low, gasping for breath as the ocean retreated. The sound of the waves lapping against the shore was the only thing filling the void. He remained there, trembling, his fingers digging into the scorched surface, alive and breathing in the harsh, golden light of the afternoon. The ringing in his ears began to subside, replaced by the rhythmic pulse of the tide. Jonah pushed his weight onto his feet, his muscles protesting the strain. The sand shifted beneath him, unstable and hot. He stood, his knees locking, and looked out toward the horizon where the sea met the sky, the same line he had once tried to vanish beyond. The air grew still. The birds, which had been silent for days, began a sudden, sharp chorus in the nearby dunes. Then the warmth returned. It was not the heat of the sun, but a radiant pressure that settled over his shoulders. The light intensified, turning the pale beach into a blinding, golden expanse. Jonah did not shield his eyes. He felt the familiar resonance in the air, the sound of rushing waters that preceded the command. He remained motionless as the mandate took hold, his jaw relaxing, the last of his resistance draining away with the salt water dripping from his skin. He bowed his head, his chin touching his chest, and felt the weight of the path ahead. His voice was thin, rasping from the dry air, but steady when he finally spoke. "I will go." The commitment hung in the air, absolute and final, and he turned away from the water to face the long, dusty road toward the city. The road ahead was a jagged line of heat and stone. Jonah moved with a steady, rhythmic pace, his boots crunching against the loose shale of the hills. Each step sent small stones tumbling into the ravines below. The sun hung high and unforgiving, baking the moisture from the air until it shimmered in waves above the ground. He climbed through narrow passes where the wind whistled against the rock face, stripping away the last remnants of his salt-crusted exhaustion. His pace did not falter, even as the terrain shifted from firm earth to deep, shifting dunes that swallowed his stride. He stopped only once at a high, rocky ridge to survey the horizon. The landscape stretched out, a brutal expanse of dry ridges and bleached valleys. He adjusted his stance, felt the tension in his calves, and turned back to the path. There were no more diversions, no more detours. He kept his eyes fixed on the path, his breath measured, his body moving in a constant, forward motion that defied the searing heat. The mission was his only gravity now, pulling him relentlessly across the barren miles toward the city that waited in the dust. He did not look back at the sea. He only watched the horizon and walked until the sun began to dip, casting long, sharp shadows over the rocky hills. The final ridge gave way, and the land leveled into a vast, sun-baked basin. There, rising from the dust like a mountain of stone, stood the city of Nineveh. Its walls were immense, built of massive blocks that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Towers punctuated the horizon at regular intervals, casting long, jagged shadows that stretched toward him like fingers. Jonah stopped. He stood at the edge of the plain, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. From this distance, the city was a silent, imposing monolith of power. He could see the faint movement of guards atop the battlements, their spears catching the dying rays of the sun. The scale of the place was suffocating. It was a fortress of ambition and shadow, a center of influence that had long stood in defiance of everything he held sacred. He took one step, then another, his feet dragging slightly in the fine, powdery dust. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of dried clay and the distant hum of 10,000 lives. He was alone. There were no companions, no messages of support, only the weight of the command he carried. He reached the perimeter of the outer works, his gaze fixed on the towering iron-bound gates that stood slightly ajar. He halted, staring into the dark throat of the city, and prepared to cross the threshold into the heart of his enemy. Jonah stepped through the iron-bound gates, and the world changed. The relative silence of the plains vanished, replaced instantly by a wall of sound. He was shoved by a passing porter, his shoulder jarring against a stack of crates. The market was a labyrinth of narrow lanes, choked with humanity. Voices rose in a cacophony of shouting, bargaining, and sharp, rhythmic hammer strikes from nearby smithies. Heat radiated from the packed bodies, thick with the smell of roasting meat, pungent spices, and unwashed wool. Jonah kept his head down, weaving through the crush of people who moved with a frantic, selfish energy. He felt the vibration of a heavy cart passing inches from his heels, its wooden wheels rattling against the uneven stone. Every direction he turned, he faced a new obstacle. A merchant waving silks, a group of soldiers clearing a path with the butts of their spears, a cluster of children darting between legs. He was a singular, quiet pulse in a sea of frantic noise. He gripped his staff, knuckles white, and pressed forward. The deeper he walked, the more the city seemed to close in, a dense web of commerce and motion that threatened to swallow him entirely. He did not look at the faces of those who brushed past him. He only watched the ground, looking for a break in the chaos where he could finally stop and speak. Jonah reached a wide intersection where the paths of the city converged. He stopped. The momentum of the crowd pushed against him, but he stood firm, planting his feet on the sun-scorched stone. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, feeling the pulse of the city against his skin, then opened them. He drew a breath that filled his lungs to their limit. He did not whisper. He did not plead. He raised his voice, and it cut through the din like a blade. 40 days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. The sound echoed off the high walls, vibrating through the ground. The effect was immediate. A merchant holding a scale froze. A porter dropped his bundle, the contents spilling across the road. The shouting stopped. The rhythmic hammering from the nearby forge ceased, leaving a ringing void in the air. People turned, their faces pale, eyes wide with a sudden, icy shock. The frantic movement of the market evaporated. A man reached for a blade and let his hand fall limp at his side. A woman clutched a child to her chest, looking toward the sky. The entire square held its breath, the threat of judgment hanging over them, heavy and absolute. The noise was gone. Only the weight of the words remained. The news did not crawl. It surged. It moved from the square, through the courtyards, and up the marble stairs of the palace. Guards at the inner gate stepped aside, their grip on their spears trembling. Inside the throne room, the king sat beneath a canopy of gold. He looked up as the doors burst open. A messenger fell to his knees, his breath coming in jagged gasps, repeating the words that had silenced the city. The king stood. His face went gray, the blood draining away as if he had been struck by a physical blow. He did not ask for proof. He did not call for his soldiers to seize the speaker. He reached up, his fingers digging into the metal of his crown, and tore it from his head. It clattered against the stone floor, rolling away into the shadows. He clawed at the heavy fabric draped across his shoulders, pulling it loose until it fell in a heap at his feet. His hands found the hearth, where the dying embers of the morning fire still glowed. He gathered a handful of gray, gritty ash and pressed it against his forehead. He sank onto the cold floor, his body shaking with the weight of the coming end. The palace, once a fortress of pride, fell into a hollow, suffocating silence. The decree left the palace like a shockwave. Royal heralds sprinted into every street, their voices cracking as they delivered the king's command. There would be no food, no water. Every soul in Nineveh was to turn their faces toward the ground in prayer. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. In the barracks, a soldier stood mid-swing during training. He felt the weight of his spear, looked at the blade, and let the iron shaft slip from his grasp. It struck the ground with a dull, ringing thud that echoed through the courtyard. He did not pick it up. Across the market, a merchant stood behind his scales. His hands trembling as he reached for a dishonest weight, he stopped, his fingers hovering over the metal, then swept his entire stock off the table, sending ceramic shards and grain across the dirt. He fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands. The constant, deceptive hum of trade died. The city, once defined by its relentless noise, now echoed with the sound of thousands of people weeping in the dust. Greed gave way to a hollow, aching dread. The pride that had balanced these walls crumbled into a singular, desperate desire for mercy. From the highest official to the lowest laborer, every knee touched the earth. The transformation was total. The weeping subsided, replaced by a silence so thick it felt tangible. Nineveh was no longer a city of stone and ambition. It was a vast, breathing expanse of bowed heads. In the central plaza, gray dust settled, streets hushed, crowds vanished. No one spoke. Even the stray dogs that usually haunted the alleys went still, pressing their bellies against the sun-baked earth. The silence rippled through the residential districts, climbing the staircases and hushing the nurseries. Inside the homes, families huddled together, their hands pressed into the dirt, their eyes shut tight. It was a silence that demanded nothing and offered everything. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a response that had not yet come. Every person in the city, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, shared a singular, rhythmic pulse of anticipation. The walls of Nineveh, once symbols of defiance, now stood as a boundary for a city stripped of its arrogance. The horizon remained clear. The sky offered no sound. Yet, in the heart of that profound stillness, the collective weight of their remorse rose upward, an invisible tide pressing against the very gates of heaven. The sky above the city walls began to shift. The oppressive, leaden weight that had hung over the horizon for 40 days did not break with thunder, but with a subtle, warming glow. The tension that had held every soul in Nineveh in a state of rigid fear softened, as if the air itself were exhaling. Where there had been the imminent threat of ruin, there was now a profound, quiet stability. The cracks in the mortar of the city gates did not widen. They remained still. The dust on the ground, once the symbol of their mourning, caught a sliver of golden light that filtered through the clouds. It was an unseen hand, pulling back the storm. The violence that had defined the city for generations vanished, scrubbed clean by the sincerity of their turn toward mercy. The people remained on their knees, not because they were forced, but because they were held in a moment of pure, unexpected reprieve. The city of Nineveh, prepared for annihilation, stood whole. No fire fell. No walls collapsed. The divine gaze that had searched their hearts found the change it sought, and in that silent, miraculous exchange, the decree of judgment was set aside. Grace filled the streets, quiet and absolute. Jonah stood on the ridge overlooking the city, his hands resting on the rough stone of the parapet. Below him, the streets of Nineveh were waking, not to the sound of war, but to the hum of a city learning to breathe again. He watched the people move through the markets, their pace measured, their voices low. He felt the wind stir against his skin, warm and steady. He looked at his own calloused palms, then back at the gates he had walked through with such heavy defiance. The mercy he had once wanted to deny them had become the very thing that anchored him to the earth. He understood now that the path he had traveled from the dark hold of a ship to the depths of the sea was never about the destination, but about the breaking of his own hardened resolve. He watched the golden light spill over the rooftops, illuminating the city that remained. He did not turn away. He remained still, watching as the shadows retreated from the walls, his heart finally aligned with the vast, quiet grace that had spared them all. The world seemed to expand, growing brighter, until everything faded into a single, blinding point of light.
Like the video? Then like and subscribe to the channel. A glowing thumbs up shimmers as the red button pulses gently. Join our community today and ring the bell for more. We are waiting for you.